I want to take you back to time. You were going to say something specifically about time. You did. You talked about the past, and you talked about that we really can't be 100% in the present, because by the time we're aware that we're in the present, we're
Yeah.
just clicking into something that just happened a few seconds ago.
And what that boils down to is that there's no such thing as the present. It's really just the very recent past. Because what we perceive consciously as happening now actually happened about a tenth of a second before.
Fascinating.
So,
wow.
So the present kind of filters out of the whole thing. When you're remote viewing supposedly present and past, you're really always remote viewing the past. It's just a matter of degree. The future is a whole different breed of cat here. In fact, a cat of nine tails showing on there.
I was going to say, it's because a lot of the remote viewing commercialism that's on the internet is very much geared toward being able to see the future with precision using remote viewing. That's one of the things that both attracted me, but also as I did my research, I realized there's a lot of discrepancy between methods and protocols that different practitioners are using and teaching and packaging and claiming that are all very different. So you learned from the original Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ and Ingo?
Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, yeah.
Right. Talk about that method and protocol for just a moment.
Well, see, now I'm tempted to go in two different directions here. All right, yeah, that's probably a good thing to do. Okay, so basically what happened is once I got recruited by the Army, and we didn't get to that story, but I had no idea that remote viewing existed. And they came to me and said, we think you might be good. Do you want to do it? And of course, at that point, there was no question. It was one of the most fascinating things I'd ever heard in the military. And I said, sure, I'd love to try it. So what they did is they shipped me and some other folks off to California to the Stanford Research Institute, actually known by then as SRI International, huge government think tank. This remote viewing thing was just a tiny wart on the back of the neck of SRI, frankly.
Why do you refer to it as a wart? Because it was like a tiny, like appendage?
Well, it was because that by and large, most people kind of look down their nose at it. I mean, it had the support of the SRI leadership, I guess you'd call it. It had the support of them, and it had the support of some other folks. But by and large, if anybody there knew about it, it was mostly hard scientists at SRI. Oh, they had social sciences as well. But all those kind of folks are really in the present, touchy-feely. We don't believe in this kind of stuff.
Well, it's kind of scary, don't you think?
Well, it is for them, which is exactly what my whole dissertation is about.
Yeah, because isn't the military kind of paradigm about control and command and that which you have dominion over, and then there's this huge project that has to do with that which we don't have any dominion over.
Yeah. Well, although SRI is pretty much all civilian, but nonetheless they do have kind of that same context, that same format of belief, right? So they were a bit uncomfortable. It was a strange mix to be researching so-called paranormal phenomenon in a think tank that specialized in studying the effects of nuclear weapons and long-range communications and all kinds of stuff like that, right? So anyway, I get shipped off there to these guys, and it's a very small operation in a very large think tank. And
were you nervous at any point?
My big nervous, the thing I was nervous about was whether or not I'd actually be able to do it.
Got it. That's what you said in your book, actually.
Yeah, I wasn't worried about going there. That was an adventure. And I was very excited about that. I wasn't particularly worried about the phenomenon itself. I didn't feel that it was evil or a threat or anything like that. In fact, it kind of fit in. It just felt right. But my worry was I didn't know if I could actually do it. So we go and we get trained in this process, which, of course, as I said, is called controlled remote viewing. And it really kind of starts at the actual foundation of human perception. It's a bare bones thing, makes no metaphysical assumptions. We don't think in terms of channeling. We don't think in terms of spirit cells. We don't think in terms of any of the kind of standard explanations people have for so-called psychic phenomena. It just is a bare bones matter of fact. Do this, do this, do this. We have this idea that there's got to be something like a matrix to get the information from, just because of how the phenomenon works. What they were doing was allowing the phenomenon to tell them about itself, rather than they trying to impose their preconceived notions on how the phenomenon ought to behave.
That's fascinating. That's almost like letting the art speak to you, letting the
And
art tell you what it is instead of you trying to impose your view on what the art is.
yes, and of course I studied art, so I think that's where that metaphor came from.
Wow. Okay, good.
Because it really is kind of like that. And the value of this, and one of the values in the fact that it was physicists that got into this and not parapsychologists. One of the issues I'm observing in the parapsychology discipline, which I have great respect for, is that oftentimes it's turned around, where people come into the discipline, they have a kind of a preconceived notion about what being psychic, or whatever we want to call it, is all about. And so then they study it from the perspective of their own preconceptions. And quite frequently, experiments fail, replications don't work, they don't show a very strong effect, and they think it's because there's something wrong with the phenomenon, when in reality it's the narrow constraints that they are imposing on it that keep it from being able to be realized in its full potential.
Don't you think that most people, even very capable people, have a certain dynamic where they're used to imposing their will, their opinions, their thought projections onto things anyway? And therefore, until they can get totally quiet and access the capacity for reception, it's a challenge.
Well, I think if everybody could do what you said last,
Right.
you would have a much less interesting world, because there'd be much less conflict.
Okay. Well, I hear that Richard Bach, who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, put up 40 grand for this project.
He did.
Isn't
and
that
he
cool?
actually wrote. He wrote an introduction to the book. So what happened was, the CIA came. Back up a little bit more. Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann got together in a very interesting way. Neither one of them intended to get together, but it ended up that way through a chain of events. And they did an experiment, and actually in the physics building at Stanford University, which was successful. And Puthoff circulated a little paper around describing the experiment, and the CIA got a hold of it. And the CIA was actually looking for someone like Puthoff. They didn't know who it would be, but they were looking for someone like Puthoff because the Soviets were hugely involved in the field, and the CIA needed a credible scientist to help them find out if there's anything to parapsychology, if it was a potential threat. So they got a hold of Puthoff's paper, and they said, well, we got to look into this. So they came out and they talked to Puthoff. They ran a couple of tests and stuff with Ingo, and it was successful. So they said, we're going to give you some money and do a contract. But before they got around to doing that, the program got going, but there wasn't any funding for it because the CIA hadn't come through with what they needed yet. And so Puthoff, and by this time Russell Targ had come on board, they beat the bushes until they found somebody who could help them finance the early stages of the program, and that one of those was Richard Bach.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that totally amazing?
Yeah.
Wow, is he alive still?
He is. I actually had some interaction with him a year ago. We were hoping to get him as a speaker at our annual remote viewing conference. And he declined. He's in his mid-70s. He's got a certain amount of stuff that he needs to get done before he dies, I guess, is kind of how he put it. He didn't put it literally that way, but that's what the impression
Sure. No, the whole sense of time changes as you get older.
Yeah, you find out, 15 books to write, and I have time to write 2. Bach put up the 40K, but his condition was, and I don't know if I got this in my book, because Hal has kind of told me about this more recently. His condition was that he had to do a remote viewing session first to see if it really worked. And so Bach actually became an experimental subject. And did at least one remote viewing trial, double blind, the whole procedure. And it was successful, and he was impressed enough, he said, okay, and he wrote him a check. And he also wrote the introduction to their book, Mind Reach, or an introduction.
Is that still available too?
Yes. I can't remember. Hampton Roads Press published republish